So domain number 1, security and risk management. Let's start by talking about what's going to be in this domain, and then we'll get into the first concept of security and risk management. The domain 1 addresses the framework and the policies, the concepts, standards to establish criteria for protecting your information assets. What does that mean? Well, it means risk assessment, risk mitigation, risk transfer, risk avoidance, all of the things related to how you identify the policies in your organization related to the risk and the factors that are affecting your organization. This could be driven by internal policy. It could be driven by industry regulations, depending on whether or not you're in a specific field. It could be driven by, governance by the United States government. There's lots and lots of different things that can drive these policies in your network, and we're going to spend a lot of time talking about those various aspects. Governance and business behaviors, right? As a information assurance professional, it's very important that you understand these frameworks and you understand what drives the need for information assurance, governance, and policy. So we're going to spend some time talking about that in this domain. Administrative, technical, and physical controls. Give me an example of a technical control. Any ideas? Remember, this is all related to ensuring information assurance. So what would be an example of a technical control that would assure information assurance?
Next to them, to like the electronic controlling box.
Okay, absolutely, yeah. It's a technological component that drives policy and enforces policy and ensures adherence to policy, right? Probably the one that I get the most is just a firewall. A firewall is a technical control. A router with access control list is a technical control. Whatever you said is a technical control. I'm not going to repeat it, but it's technology that allows us to enforce policy, right? What about a physical control then? Those are all physical devices, aren't they? But a physical control is security guards, a fence, CCTV cameras, etc. Absolutely. And then administrative controls, acceptable use policy, whatever it might be, right? Written policies, social engineering training, whatever it might be, those are administrative controls. The whole point of these controls is to protect confidentiality, integrity, and availability, what we call the CIA triad. And we'll talk more about that in the lesson, right? Policies, procedures, standards, baselines, and guidelines, all right? Policies are essentially kind of what we're trying to establish. The procedures are how we do that. The standards may be the standards that we follow that drive policy. And then the baselines are what our baseline security posture is, and then guidelines would be other ways to enforce policies, right? Whether it be a physical control, a technical control, or an administrative control. So we see a lot of, all of these things we'll talk about in this domain, right? Risk assessment and risk analysis, a very, very important concept on the exam. You have to be both well-versed in quantitative as well as qualitative assessments. We'll talk about the difference between quantitative and qualitative as we go through the lesson here as well. And then we'll talk about BCPs and DRPs. A lot of acronyms on the test, so it's important that you understand those acronyms. Usually throughout the course, what I've done is I've kind of highlighted. Anything that's highlighted is generally going to be kind of highlighted on the exam as well. So you need to understand what a business continuity plan is, what a disaster recovery plan is, and the difference between the two, right? For example, well, not for example, let me just ask you, what is the difference between, say, a business continuity plan and disaster recovery? The way I describe it is I say, okay, one is proactive and one is reactive, right? Which one would be proactive? BCP, right? Because business continuity means that we are trying to establish policies, procedures, guidelines, etc., that keep the business operational. Whereas disaster recovery is the business is not operational, and we're now trying to recover from that. So there is a difference between those two concepts there. All right. As far as the topics go, pretty much the same thing we just talked about. The concepts of confidentiality, integrity, and availability, that CIA triad. Security governance, principles, and compliance. Governance is one of the things that you're going to have to be aware of. There are several different models that we'll introduce in this lesson that a lot of agencies will follow to drive their policies and procedures. Legal and regulatory issues, documented security policies, security standards, procedures and guidelines, business continuity requirements, personnel, security policies, risk management concepts, threat modeling, very important concept. Threat modeling is the idea where you're kind of taking a look at your assets, taking a look at your personnel, taking a look at your business profile, and identifying threat vectors against that business profile. I always kind of use an analogy. We are a small IT training company, and we do perform financial transactions on a daily basis, but we're less likely to be a target than, say, a bank, right, that does millions of dollars or trillions of dollars of online transactions. So, the threats might be the same for both organizations. The threat vectors might be the same, but the likelihood is a little bit less for us than it might be for somebody that has, is more involved in and has more visibility in mainstream, right? So threat modeling is the concept of not only analyzing the threat vectors, but also analyzing and identifying likelihood that something is going to occur, right? Very, very important concept. Integrating security risk and considerations into your acquisition strategy, very important as well. When you're acquiring new technology, you're acquiring a company, you're acquiring personnel, that all comes into play when you're integrating the associated risk to those acquisitions into your organization. And then finally, security, education, training, and awareness. So this is kind of a more in-depth look at what we're going to cover in this domain, but it's all good stuff. It's an interesting domain. All right. So business continuity risk management framework. This is actually a pretty interesting slide because it really kind of summarizes really a lot of the things that we'll be talking about throughout the domain. We see strategic, we see financial, we see organization, we see technology, operations, and legal and regulatory. So let's take a look first at strategic and what it says here. All right. So inherent risks in the business environment and the effect, objectives, and performance. What does that mean? Talk about business continuity. So this flow chart is supposed to define what? Strategic goals. Points of interest, right? Remember what I said about the risks that are tied to my organization might be similar to the risks that are tied to a different organization, but because of the visibility of my organization, that inherent risk is not necessarily as high as maybe a much more well-known organization, right? So it says inherent risks in the business environment and the effect, objectives, and performance. So what we're talking about is what are the risks to the business and the business environment, and what would be the effect of our policy objectives for our business continuity framework and performance objectives for the business. So that's the strategy that the business is going to employ in order to ensure business continuity. And we're going to get into this in a lot more detail as we go through the lesson here. If you look at the financial aspect, right, financial involves liquidity, cap funding, inability to raise debt or equity capital needed for short-term liquidity or long-term growth, and uncertainty in pricing or sales assets or uncertainty in pricing or sales of assets or liabilities. Yeah, I guess. I mean, I don't really need to explain that, right? It makes perfect sense. The ability for a business to continue to grow based on their financial position, right? They just did an announcement yesterday. Actually, it came down on Friday, where the Feds basically limited the growth capacity of Wells Fargo. They said, you guys have $3 trillion in assets. You're not allowed to grow anymore. You're not allowed to accumulate any more assets until you can demonstrate that you, can ensure policies and procedures. You guys all know what happened with Wells Fargo, right? Well, that's a big deal to tell the second largest bank in the United States, besides Chase, that you guys can't grow anymore, right? You can keep what you have, but you're not allowed to grow anymore, right? And that's driven by, of course, government policy. But so the ability for a business or an organization to be fluid based on their financial standpoint could be potentially a risk, right? Credit, of course, that's easy enough to say. We all deal with credit on a regular basis. Good credit means that you can borrow money, you can pay for things, you can invest in new technologies. Bad credit, not so much, right? The credit worthiness of a business is very important as well from that perspective. It says here, exposure to loss related to change in credit worthiness of a counterparty, collateral, customer, or partner that impacts the party's ability to fulfill obligations under a contract. It's pretty straightforward, right? And you can understand how that could directly relate to your security posture. If you don't have the financial means or the credit to be able to apply whatever policies or procedures or controls that you want to implement. The market itself, right? Volatility in the market could affect the business. So the organizational risks, risks that are a part of units, environments related to people, culture, structure, values impacting effectiveness. These would be more specific to your business, and depending on the line of business that you're in, will determine what that risk is. We'll get into quite a bit in this module, in this particular domain. We'll get into a lot of that assessment based on the environment. Are you in the healthcare industry? Are you in the are you in the public sector? Are you private sector? Are you in the financial industry, and so on? The culture, the people, the personnel, the structure changes depending on that organization and what the footprint of that organization is. Risks tied to technology, right? Integration, support, functionality. Just because technology is available doesn't mean that it always is the best option for implementing your controls. Oftentimes, companies or businesses or entities will implement controls that will actually make their business less secure because the controls are implemented poorly, the technology is implemented poorly, or it's not implemented in a way that it should be. So that's important as well. From an operational process, people, that's a big aspect. We're going to talk quite a bit about this concept of social engineering and not only that, but data loss prevention. People are very fluid. Technology is pretty easy to deal with, right? I set up a firewall, the policies are static on that firewall, I can secure that device. It's a lot more difficult to secure a person or to change a person's motives for doing things or not doing things appropriately, right? It's a very fluid environment, and so the risk of loss resulting from people can be pretty difficult to work with. Not only that, people themselves are an asset. Could be as simple as training an engineer or an employee on all of your security policies and procedures, and then they're responsible for ensuring that those policies are met and those procedures are met, and then they go and go work for somebody else, or they leave the company. So stuff that you have to deal with. Processes, processes kind of relate to all the stuff that we're talking about here. The risk or loss resulting from inadequate or failed processes, right? I've always told people going through any of the security classes that I teach that the most important aspect to any security posture is that it's a living, breathing thing. Just because a process is effective today doesn't mean that that process is effective tomorrow or the next day or the next day. So, companies and organizations, they'll implement a process. They don't audit the process. They don't ensure that the appropriate training has been done for that process, and it becomes a risk factor in the organization. Okay? Events, the risk of loss resulting from an unexpected event that interferes with normal business. This could be, acts of God, earthquake, fire, flood, etc. Could be sabotage. It could be, an organization that you partner with that processes, say, credit card transactions for your company. They get compromised. That becomes an event in your organization as well. And then final, legal and regulatory. Risks related to contract enforcement, interpretation of laws, compliance with law, impact of regulation. Obviously, being with the Navy, of course, you have a lot of regulatory components that you have to follow, right? Being in the financial industry, you have a lot of regulatory components you have to follow, healthcare, etc. So this whole slide here really kind of depicts what the whole goal of this first domain is, to go through all of these concepts here, all right? And we'll see that as part of our discussion.